For thousands of years, long before modern civilization took shape, human beings looked at the sky and asked the exact same questions we do today. Who created us, and what happens when our lives end? To preserve the answers they found, early societies turned to the earth itself. They carved their spiritual beliefs into stone and pressed them into fragile scrolls, desperate to pass their wisdom forward. Over time, these beliefs became the central pillars of human civilization. Entire empires, legal codes, and massive institutions were built around the teachings held within sacred texts. Every major culture on Earth believed they possessed ultimate divine truth. Yet they all shared one critical vulnerability. They were entirely dependent on physical materials to keep that truth alive. Before the invention of the printing press, perfectly transmitting massive amounts of information across generations was virtually impossible. Time destroys paper. Libraries burn. Languages fade, and empires eventually collapse. The natural world simply decays the physical records we leave behind. To fight this, humans had to copy massive texts completely by hand, word by word, manuscript by manuscript. And human beings make mistakes. A single tired scribe could easily alter the meaning of a passage. Over centuries of copying, editing, and translating, variations naturally appeared. In foundational texts like the Bible, these historical changes are well documented by modern scholars. For historians, the gradual degradation of ancient texts is a standard rule of human history. Finding an ancient message that has survived thousands of years completely untouched should be mathematically impossible. Then, in the harsh deserts of 7th century Arabia, a man named Muhammad claimed he was receiving direct, unedited words from the Creator. Rather than arriving as a single completed book, these revelations were spoken publicly over a period of 23 years. The language was specifically structured to be immediately memorized. Thousands of early followers acted as a massive human hard drive. They transferred the entire text into their minds, locking in the pronunciation of every single letter, while the prophet was still alive. By doing this, they bypassed the physical vulnerability of paper. The complete text was kept alive simultaneously in thousands of different minds. This created a living, generation-spanning oral tradition. It was an active backup of the text that no invading army could burn and no environment could decay. But memory was only half of the solution. While the text was being spoken and memorized, scribes were simultaneously writing down the revelations exactly as they happened. Within decades, early Islamic civilization consolidated these writings, cross-referencing them with memorizers to establish a universally accepted, standardized Arabic text. Other religions typically spent centuries compiling and debating written scriptures long after their founders died. The Quran was locked into place almost immediately. Because of this dual system, modern historians comparing ancient Quranic manuscripts discovered in the desert find them overwhelmingly identical to the versions recited by billions of people today. The combination of mass, letter-by-letter memorization and immediate written standardization solved humanity's oldest information preservation problem. When you compare this structural integrity to the physically delicate timelines of earlier ancient wisdom texts, the contrast is stark. Secular historians identify the Quranic transmission process as a departure from the standard patterns of ancient manuscript decay. Inside the text itself, there is a specific verse making a very bold declaration, a promise that the Creator himself would permanently protect the message from ever being corrupted. To a believer, this historical record serves as the physical manifestation of that promise. The preservation of the text functions as verifiable evidence of its own internal claims. Tracing the mechanics of survival explains how the words reached us. However, that explanation says nothing about the nature of the message itself. What exactly are the contents of this book? What specific words did millions of people across centuries deem worthy of flawless memorization? The pages contain statements about the natural universe that align with modern science, historical prophecies that came to pass, and highly complex mathematical structures woven directly into the Arabic language. Is it historically or logically possible for an illiterate man living in a harsh desert 1400 years ago to author a book with these exact properties. Most ancient traditions build their foundation on physical miracles: Moses parting the sea, Jesus healing the sick, events that, by definition, require you to have been there to see them. But the core miracle claimed by Islam is entirely different. It's sitting right in front of us, a physical book. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad could neither read nor write. He wasn't trained in the great academies of Rome or Persia. He lived in a largely isolated settlement in 7th century Arabia. Yet this unlettered man delivered one of the most structurally complex pieces of literature in human history. This creates a fascinating historical problem. The Quran explicitly claims to be perfectly preserved and totally unreproducible. When you analyze it, you are forced to make a choice. You are either looking at an absolute masterpiece of human synthesis or an actual, direct transmission from God. The Quran issues what is known as the challenge verse. Rather than demanding blind faith from skeptics, the text actually dares its critics to disprove it. The criteria of this test are highly specific. The Quran asks anyone who doubts its divine origin to produce just a single chapter that matches its level of linguistic complexity, structure, and emotional impact. That challenge has created a 1,400-year gridlock. Believers look at 14 centuries of scholars and poets failing to meet the benchmark as proof of its divinity. Skeptics, on the other hand, point out that passing a literary test is impossible to judge objectively. So how do we evaluate a text that claims to be authored by the creator of the universe? We run an audit. We are going to test the Quran's divine claims across 3 specific pillars of evidence: literature, science, and prophecy. We start in the cultural landscape of 7th century Arabia. At this time, poetry was the ultimate currency. Tribes held massive literary competitions, and mastery of the Arabic language was a direct path to social and political power. Then, the Quran was recited. Its cadence broke the existing rules of Arabic grammar and syntax. It utilized a completely new rhythmic structure that didn't sound like traditional tribal poetry, nor did it fit the mold of standard prose. Historical accounts detail how deeply this impacted the audience. Even some of the fiercest public opponents of Islam would sneak out of their homes at night to secretly listen to the text being recited. Believers argue this linguistic perfection is clear evidence of a higher power. Critics look at the exact same history and conclude that literary beauty is inherently subjective. No matter how moving the poetry is, they argue, linguistic brilliance cannot be empirically proven as supernatural. That brings us to our second pillar, and the center of the modern debate: science. A major argument today is that the Quran contains specific knowledge of the natural world that would be completely impossible for a human living in the 7th century to possess. Take cosmology. One verse describes the heavens expanding. Many Muslims draw a direct line between this text and the modern discovery that our universe is in a constant state of expansion, a fact not scientifically verified until the 20th century. We see similar claims in biology. Other verses outline distinct sequential stages of human development inside the womb, detailing how tissue and bone form, which supporters argue perfectly aligns with modern embryology. And in geology, the text describes mountains as acting like stabilizing roots or pegs beneath the Earth's surface, a concept some link directly to the deep structural roots of mountain ranges discovered by modern geologists. The scientific community, however, pushes back hard on these interpretations. Secular historians categorize these arguments as retrospective pattern matching, taking modern scientific discoveries and projecting them backward onto vague poetic verses. They also note that earlier ancient civilizations already possessed basic working knowledge of fetal development and geography long before the 7th century. If science is heavily debated, we have to look at our final evidentiary pillar: historical prophecy. This shifts our focus away from the natural world and directly into geopolitical foresight. The most famous example is known as the Byzantine prophecy. During the Prophet Muhammad's life, the Byzantine Empire suffered a devastating, seemingly fatal military collapse against the Persian army. To observers at the time, the Roman powerhouse was finished. But the Quran made a highly specific prediction. It stated that, defying all geopolitical odds, the Byzantines would unexpectedly recover and achieve victory within a few short years. Historically, that is exactly what happened. The Byzantines rallied and pushed the Persians back. For Muslims, accurately calling a massive, unlikely geopolitical reversal years in advance is irrefutable proof of divine sight. Critics dismiss this. They argue that political predictions are educated guesses based on broad trends. By analyzing the landscape, a sharp observer could calculate a counterattack was possible. To skeptics, successful predictions are often just the result of survivor's bias, rather than definitive proof of divine intervention. When you step back from the individual debates over poetry, science, and prophecy, you are still left with an enormous real-world outcome. This single text ignited one of the most expansive and advanced civilizations in human history, shaping law, architecture, and science across continents. Unlike many ancient religious texts that sit quietly in museum archives, the Quran remains a profoundly active, living artifact. It is currently studied, recited, and entirely memorized word for word by millions of people globally. Believers view this synchronized global recitation as the active, living fulfillment of the Quran's original divine claim, that God would protect the text from ever being lost or altered. Regardless of whether you conclude the text is of human design or divine origin, the text's historical impact and its preservation across 14 centuries are empirically undeniable facts. But this is where the physical evidence reaches its limit. Language, science, and historical prophecy can provide compelling arguments, but they can never offer an absolute, mathematical proof of God. At a certain point, the final step will always require a leap of faith. However, while the contents of the text require faith, the physical history of the book itself does not. The record of how this text was written, compiled, and standardized remains available to us through physical artifacts. In Part 3, we enter the battlefield of history itself. The battleground over the Quran's divine claim has shifted into archaeology, the science of textual criticism, and the study of ancient, weathered manuscripts. Billions of people live by a single foundational premise, that the holy scriptures they read today are the exact, unaltered words of God. But before the printing press, every religious text on earth passed through a narrow physical constraint. Every single copy had to be individually hand-copied, one character at a time, for over 1,000 years. This era was defined by fragility. A scribe might misread a word in a dimly lit monastery, or an entire library could be lost to a single city fire or an invading army. Because of these hazards, we face a difficult archaeological fact. We possess 0 original copies written by the prophets or apostles themselves. We only possess copies of copies. To find the truest version of the message, historians have to compare the contrasting preservation strategies used by the early Christian and Islamic worlds. The early Bible spread through a decentralized movement. It wasn't managed by a single government. Instead, it moved across continents in a mixture of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. This multilingual expansion meant that thousands of manuscripts were produced in isolation. Naturally, they began to show differences in wording and even the number of verses included in a book. This Gospel of Mark manuscript contains a famous example. Later copies describe Jesus appearing after the resurrection, but older versions end abruptly. Historians view this as evidence of texts changing over centuries, while many Christians see them as minor variations, leaving the spiritual core untouched. Over time, these local differences and theological councils led different denominations to adopt different collections of books, which is why a Catholic Bible contains writings that a Protestant Bible does not. The Bible's historical path was organic. It allowed for human variation in the physical manuscript to prioritize a rapid, widespread distribution of the message. The Quran followed a different path. Early Muslim leaders faced a crisis when the men who had memorized the text orally began dying in battle, threatening to take the revelation with them. In response, the third caliph, Uthman, launched a state-sponsored project to codify a single official written version of the Quran. Once this official version was complete, Uthman ordered it distributed to every corner of the empire. To ensure unity, he reportedly ordered any unofficial or variant copies to be gathered and destroyed. Because the earliest Arabic script lacked the dots and vowel marks used today, a single written word could be pronounced in several ways. These accepted variations in recitation, known as kirat, allowed for different pronunciations of the same standardized text. To critics, this history suggests a deliberate effort to edit out early diversity. To Islamic scholars, it represents a successful effort to protect the text from the very human errors that affected other scriptures. In the last century, both of these historical narratives were tested as archaeologists began unearthing texts that had been buried in the sand for nearly 2,000 years. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran provided Hebrew texts 1,000 years older than previous copies. They showed that while the central text was remarkably consistent, some passages matched different ancient versions than the ones we use today. A similar find occurred in Yemen with the Sana'a manuscripts. These are palimpsests, parchments where an original text was erased so a new one could be written over it. Modern imaging shows the erased layer sometimes used different word orders than the standardized Quranic text. These physical artifacts prove that ancient scriptures were more fluid in their early years than traditional histories often suggest. They force us to look at the actual evidence left behind by the people who held the pens. For centuries, these complex debates over erased ink and manuscript variants were conducted within the closed doors of elite universities and religious institutions. Today, that information is available to anyone with a smartphone. Ancient textual criticism has moved from the archives to social media, fueling heated debates between skeptics and believers. This sudden access to raw historical data can be jarring. For some, it challenges the idea of a perfect text. For others, the survival of these ancient fragments powerfully confirms their faith. History can reveal the politics of the past and the physical path of the ink, but it eventually reaches a limit. Archaeology can show us how the words were preserved, but it cannot tell us if those words are divine. For thousands of years, humans have turned to ancient texts to navigate existence. These scriptures have drawn the borders of empires, ordered armies into battle, and dictated the daily rhythms of billions of lives. But when we look at the sheer number of competing spiritual paths across the globe, we run into a mathematical problem. Can every one of these traditions simultaneously hold the ultimate truth, or is there only one correct answer? At a glance, the world's major faiths seem to sing in harmony. Read through their core texts, and you will find the exact same universal baselines repeated: clear mandates to give to the poor, treat neighbors with compassion, and maintain strict moral boundaries. That ethical overlap is comforting. It suggests a shared human spirit. But that surface-level agreement masks a deep, structural incompatibility right beneath the floorboards. Once you move past the behavioral guidelines and examine the actual mechanics of how these religions say the universe operates, the agreement completely vanishes. Take this diagram mapping the concept of God. Judaism and Islam demand absolute oneness. Christianity splits the divine into a trinity. Hindu traditions spread across a decentralized web. The endpoints also conflict. A linear timeline ends permanently, while others loop infinitely through reincarnation. A single universe cannot simultaneously operate on a linear timeline and an infinite loop. Because these foundational claims cancel each other out, simple logic requires that they cannot all be objectively correct. The arrival of the modern age applied a new stress test to these ancient scriptures. Laboratories and testable data began answering the exact physical questions that were once the exclusive territory of priests and prophets. Telescopes proved the Earth was not the center of the solar system. The fossil record mapped out a long, slow biological evolution. The literal, week-long creation narratives found in ancient texts were suddenly up against observable mechanics. This triggered an intense period of skepticism. In university lecture halls and across global internet forums, new generations began subjecting sacred manuscripts to rigorous historical and logical audits. The result was a sharp cultural split. For many, empirical data stripped away the need for a divine creator, but for others, uncovering the extreme, interlocking complexity of cellular biology and astrophysics only reinforced their conviction that a grand designer had to exist. To see how ancient texts survive this modern pressure cooker, look at the Quran. Its verses are recited daily by people across drastically different environments, echoing through isolated, developing villages just as loudly as they do in the financial districts of Western cities. Islam is currently expanding at a rapid pace. Millions of adults actively convert each year, specifically drawn to the strict daily discipline, the massive global community, and the promise of a direct, unfiltered connection to God. Yet it also faces intense global friction. Adherents constantly navigate a complex web of modern political conflicts, debates over extremism, and competing international media narratives. The fact that an ancient text can endure total scientific scrutiny and intense media pressure and still grow points to an unavoidable conclusion. These scriptures are providing an essential human utility that raw data simply cannot replace. That utility creates a fascinating modern paradox. Despite centuries of holy wars and those irreconcilable theological contradictions we looked at earlier, billions of people with opposing beliefs manage to wake up, go to work, and live peacefully side by side every single day. Peace is possible because people rely on faith for something science was never designed to provide. Astrophysics can map out exactly how gravity formed the Milky Way, but it is completely silent on why the universe exists in the first place. No amount of technological advancement has cured the primal human need to define right and wrong, to seek assurance that there is something beyond death, and to understand the concept of the soul. If you only analyze religion as a sterile academic debate over historical manuscripts, you miss the actual engine driving it. Faith is a tool built to manufacture ultimate meaning. So we pull back from the empires, the global statistics, and the historical debates, arriving at the psychological reality of the individual. A Christian may find profound renewal in the story of the cross. A Muslim may feel absolute peace hearing the Quran recited. A Buddhist achieves clarity through meditation, and a secular seeker finds awe in the cosmos itself. Those internal emotional experiences are entirely real. Historians can verify ancient documents, and scientists can measure the physical world. But at the end of the day, when the arguments stop, every person sits entirely alone with the evidence, forced to make a choice. Whether you commit to the words of a specific holy book or choose to reject all of them entirely, that deliberate, relentless search for truth is what makes us human. The arrival of the modern age applied a new stress test to these ancient scriptures. Laboratories and testable data began answering the exact physical questions that were once the exclusive territory of priests and prophets. Telescopes proved the Earth was not the center of the solar system. The fossil record mapped out a long, slow biological evolution. The literal, week-long creation narratives found in ancient texts were suddenly up against observable mechanics. This triggered an intense period of skepticism. In university lecture halls and across global internet forums, new generations began subjecting sacred manuscripts to rigorous historical and logical audits. The result was a sharp cultural split. For many, empirical data stripped away the need for a divine creator. But for others, uncovering the extreme, interlocking complexity of cellular biology and astrophysics only reinforced their conviction that a grand designer had to exist. To see how ancient texts survive this modern pressure cooker, look at the Quran. Its verses are recited daily by people across drastically different environments, echoing through isolated, developing villages just as loudly as they do in the financial districts of Western cities. Islam is currently expanding at a rapid pace. Millions of adults actively convert each year, specifically drawn to the strict daily discipline, the massive global community, and the promise of a direct, unfiltered connection to God. Yet it also faces intense global friction. Adherents constantly navigate a complex web of modern political conflicts, debates over extremism, and competing international media narratives. The fact that an ancient text can endure total scientific scrutiny and intense media pressure and still grow points to an unavoidable conclusion. These scriptures are providing an essential human utility that raw data simply cannot replace. That utility creates a fascinating modern paradox. Despite centuries of holy wars and those irreconcilable theological contradictions we looked at earlier, billions of people with opposing beliefs manage to wake up, go to work, and live peacefully side by side every single day. Peace is possible because people rely on faith for something science was never designed to provide. Astrophysics can map out exactly how gravity formed the Milky Way, but it is completely silent on why the universe exists in the first place. No amount of technological advancement has cured the primal human need to define right and wrong, to seek assurance that there is something beyond death, and to understand the concept of the soul. If you only analyze religion as a sterile academic debate over historical manuscripts, you miss the actual engine driving it. Faith is a tool built to manufacture ultimate meaning. So we pull back from the empires, global statistics, and historical debates, and we arrive at the psychological reality of the individual. A Christian may find profound renewal in the story of the cross. A Muslim may feel absolute peace hearing the Quran recited, and a Buddhist achieves clarity through deep meditation, while a secular seeker finds awe in the cosmos itself. Those internal emotional experiences are entirely real. Historians can verify ancient documents, and scientists can measure the physical world. But at the end of the day, when the arguments stop, every person sits entirely alone with the evidence, forced to make a choice. Whether you commit to the words of a specific holy book or choose to reject all of them entirely, that deliberate, relentless search for truth is what makes us human.